Welcome everybody. So this will be our first diversity discussion, and it will be a discussion that is at the center of the first and second part of chapter 2. So we will examine some of the elements that we discussed in neuroanatomy, and we will move on to neuroengineering, neuroimaging, developmental neuroscience, and so on and so forth. And this specific discussion has to do with intelligence. Now, when we think about diversity and we think about inclusion, we had to have a solid knowledge of what science has to say about our own origin and identity and structure and external manifestation, thoughts, emotions. And one of those factors that I would like to bring to your attention today is intelligence. So when we think about intelligence, we think of at least three main elements. We think about the ability to read between the lines, so to speak, intelligo in Latin. We mentioned this a few times. We think about testing, so personality testing on one side, but also IQ on the other side, right? So intelligence on the other side. And we also mean third, the G factor. So let's see for a second what we mean by that. Well, with the G factor, really, we identify psychometrics, and to be a psychometrician, you had to do with statistical analysis and theoretical constructs to make sure that your examination, your testing is reliable, valid, has all the parameters that we mentioned in week 1. But by G factor, G really indicates general intelligence or general intelligence factor. This is also synonymous with the general mental ability. So the idea here is that there are skills that a person needs to perform. It's a construct that was created in order to account for these cognitive abilities within human subjects, or within human intelligence. It's a variables that summarizes positive correlation among different cognitive tasks, and it reflects the fact that an individual performance on one type of these tasks tends to be comparable to that person's performance on other types of similar cognitive tasks. Now, this is of course related to IQ, because IQ, general intelligence, and cognitive ability are sometimes used interchangeably to refer to this pattern, but they're not the same thing. The G factor usually, in statistical terms, accounts for 40 to 50% of the between individual performance differences on a given cognitive test, and composite scores, so IQ scores, based on many tests, are frequently regarded as estimates on the individual standing on the G factor. Okay, so those are the distinct elements. So again, IQ and the G factor are not the same thing. They're both related, of course, in order to monitor these cognitive abilities. And IQ really stands for intelligence quotient, or intelligent quotient, which is a term that was coined by Stern in Germany to define this type of standardized test for intelligence. So differentiation between usage of this term aside, although they're very important statistically speaking, the central question here that I would like to bring to your attention for the sake of this first discussion on diversity is, how can we quantify different levels of intelligence, as a broader term, in different populations? And this is one of the essential questions in epigenetics. We always think about the nature-nurture debate. So in a course on mind versus body, this really means individual subject skill-based activity, as opposed to hereditary genetic factors. So the question may be, how much of this intelligence, this ability, can be inherited? And by inherited, do we mean inherited through genetic factors? Do we mean that we inherit that from our family, from our community, from our tribe, from constructs such as ethno-racial, ethno-cultural components? Or is something that has to do with practice, with skills, with exposure? So this is a very, very complex topic, of course, because like almost everything else in human existence, in skills and cognitive capacity and emotions and all other related processes, the answer tends to lie in between. So there are both nature So we inherited traits. There are some traits that are inherited. And nurture, things that we can learn, things we practice, things we are at least exposed in a context of education and learning and conditioning and so on and so forth. So I'd like to ask you if you could answer this question. Do you think that human intelligence is more or less learned or more or less given in a hereditary sense? Now, one of the criticisms to IQ is the very conceptualization of intelligence and whether the predictability of IQ tests are reliable. Now, I would like to separate this notion for a second, aside from the fact that there's one of the most predictive powers in psychometrics are indeed found in intelligent tests. But we are not actually asking about the validity of any specific subtest that might have some overlapping elements with IQ tests or personality tests. I'm thinking about SAT scores or GRE, etc., etc. We're not arguing about the validity of those specific tests derived from IQ testing. I'm interested in hearing your opinion about what you think our intelligence is and how can we account for where our intelligence comes from as human beings. Is it more nature or is it more nurture? Please answer below. Thank you.